Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It's great to be back. Third part of our four-part series entitled The Winds of Change. Last time we told the story of the Mussar movement, a movement that rises in the middle of the 19th century, led primarily by a man by the name of Israel Salanter, a movement focused on self-improvement, introduces ways of learning, of studying, areas of study that hadn't been a focus for the Jewish people, at least in quite some time. We noted that when this story is told, both in Jewish historiography and in secular historiography, generally the story goes something like this, that Mussar and its rise in the 1840s in Vilna is largely a response to what is often referred to as the Haskalah, the search for Jewish enlightenment that begins with Moses Mendelssohn in the late 18th century, continues on through the early 19th century with the advent of the Reform movement, a period referred to often as aesthetic reform in the 18 teens, and then a period known as religious reform starting in the 1820s, continuing on to the 1830s, and there in 1840 emerges Rabbi Israel Salanter beating back the Reform movement with his insistence and focus on Muslims. We tried to argue last time, though, that this story doesn't seem to be quite right. That, in fact, Israel Salanter was not really responding to the world of Germany, to the world of reform, to the world of enlightenment, because the search for enlightenment really doesn't come to Eastern Europe until well after Rabbi Israel Salanter has already made a name for himself and has already started promoting the study of Mussar. Instead, we noted that it is true that later on, as the new institutions focused on Mussar will open, as the students of Rabbi Israel Salanter and the students of Israel Salanter will begin to write and will begin to speak, they will in fact turn much of the emphasis of Mussar towards or against the Reform movement. But this happens later, not in response to Moses Mendelssohn and the Reform movement of the beginning of the 19th century, but to something that we often refer to either as the Russian Haskalah or the Vilna Haskalah, and that is our story for today. So this graph you have on the screen right now is pretty much what it would look like if we were to chart out the growth of Haskalah in Eastern Europe over the course of the 19th and into the early 20th century. And so I want to frame our conversation today around two central questions. Number one, why do things take off right here? Right at the end of the reign of Tsar Nicholas and into the reign of Alexander I, the late 1840s and the 1850s and 1860s seemed this explosion of popularity, of inroads made by Haskalah in Eastern Europe, which is interesting because, as we noted, Haskalah in Western Europe has been around for half a century already. It isn't new. By this point, the Reform movement has already coalesced into a full-fledged movement. Reform rabbis are having conferences already in Western Europe, and only now does it begin to take off in Eastern Europe. And the question is why? What happens in the late 1840s into the 50s and 60s that causes the popularity and sudden growth of Haskalah? Question number two. When we talk about Haskalah in Western Europe, we almost always tell a story that begins with a small group of traditional Jews. Moses Mendelssohn lived and died a traditional Jew. He was never anything but. It starts with a group of traditional Jews who were philosophers, who were engaging in Enlightenment philosophy, who begin to think about things a little bit differently than people had before, and then it progresses from this world of traditional philosophical Jews into a full-fledged movement to change the essence of Judaism that we refer to today as the Reform movement, a Reform movement which ultimately gives birth or causes an offshoot called the Conservative movement, right? Which is why it's called conservative. And it's a response to the Reform movement. But full-fledged wholesale changes in the way in which Judaism is practiced, observed, its ideas and its ideals, as much as Haskalah will grow in Eastern Europe, and it will grow. By the end of the 19th century, you'd be hard-pressed to find a Reformed synagogue anywhere in Eastern Europe. That is not to say there weren't some more modern type synagogues. There were, Dessau, St. Petersburg, and a few other places, but nothing like the Reform congregations of Western Europe. It doesn't exist. Think about your own memories, right? People in your own families, people who come from Eastern Europe. They might not have been practicing Jews. They may not have been observant, right? But the idea of Reform Judaism in Eastern Europe, which is where the vast majority of Jews live, never takes off. And the question is why? What is it about the Russian Haskalah and the Vilna Haskalah that is different than what happens in Western Europe, that it doesn't become fertile ground for full-scale changes in the way Judaism is practiced? Okay, in order to tell the story of the Russian Haskalah, we need to start at the beginning with something that's often referred to as the Galician Haskalah, because it happens amongst a small group of Jewish intellectuals in the area known as Galicia. Now, it's funny that today, when you refer to Galicia, Galicianas, we often are referring to obviously to Jews from Poland, but I'm not sure if we fully wrap our hands or embrace the fact that Galicia was probably about the most progressive place in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And Galicia, while in some imaginations may seem or may have been turned into a place that seems almost backward in today's imagination, it wasn't anything but, right, in its time. Now, why is it that Galicia was and continued to be a rather progressive Western or Western-facing area? Well, look at where it's located. What do we see about Galicia?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So let's start taking even a step before. Even while we were back under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, remember, under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Poland for hundreds of years was a country that saw itself as part of the West. Right? That was quite enlightened in many different ways, quite liberal in many ways. And Galicia was right there on the border of Central Europe. And as was correctly pointed out, even once Poland and Lithuania ceased to exist in the late 18th century, Galicia does not become part of Russia. Right? The green here indicates that it was taken by Austria. Right? It is part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not part of the Russian Empire. And therefore, it may not surprise us that the first inroads of Western Haskalah, of Western Enlightenment into what we refer to as Eastern Europe happened in Galicia, a place that has for hundreds of years seen itself as Western facing, and a place that never becomes part of the Russian Empire. Funny last name. The best of my knowledge, we aren't related. But the name most often associated with the very beginnings of the Galician Haskalah is a man by the name of Yosef Perl. Just move our little box here. Yosef Perl was born in a small town called Tarnopol. You can see it over here. He goes into business. Actually, his father was pretty successful. He goes into his father's business, and he has an occasion to travel. And he travels to Brody, which is still part of Prussia. and he travels to Vienna, which isn't here on the map, which is obviously part of Austro-Hungary. And now, in order to do business in these places, so if you're doing business with Jews, obviously you can speak what language? Yiddish, right? And if you're doing, though, business with non-Jews in these areas, you need to speak German. Okay, so Yosef Perl travels to these places, and he becomes rather taken by the culture that he sees around Jews, the larger culture, as well as the culture that he begins to see within the Jewish communities of these two places as well. So in 1813, he opens a more modern school in Tarnopol, feeling that they in Galicia also need to begin to give their Jewish students a proper education that would involve learning, whether it be Polish or German, some basic arithmetic, in addition to all of the Jewish subjects that they needed to learn. Yosef Perl, though, also becomes a rather fierce critic of some of the things that he sees in his surroundings that he feels are holding the Jewish community back, the things that he considers to be the most backward of Jewish society. Now, remember, he's writing here in the 18 teens, right, in Poland, not far from the Ukraine. What is taking hold of the Jewish masses at this point? Hasidus. Right? And Yosef Perl, who has seen what Jews in Brody look like, modernized Jews in Brody, Jews in Vienna, and remember, these are not Reformed Jews. Right? That really hasn't taken hold anywhere other than in a few slight places in Berlin, but by the 18 teens, it still hasn't become much of a thing. These are traditional Jews, but who are fully acculturated and educated in Western ways. And now he comes back to Tarnopol and he sees what is happening around him in the world of Hasidus, specifically certain ideas like avodah shebegashmius, the idea that certain physical elements have now been invested with holiness, that drinking, that partying in certain ways, that attachments to a Rebbe have become elevated in the minds of the simple folk of the Jewish community. These bother him deeply, and so he writes a work called Megala Timrin in 1819, which is it's a satire. It's a satire that, about the world of Hasidus, where he tells stories like the stories that were being told of various rabbis and tzaddikim at the time, but in a way that was intended to hold up a mirror to people, in his view, right, and show them the things that they were adopting that were ultimately holding them back, that were increasing their backwardness rather than moving them forward. Nachman Krachmal. Now, notice what the names of places that will continuously come up in this story. Nachman Krachmal is born in Brody, which means he speaks what language? German. He marries and studies in a town called Zolkiev. Zolkiev, you can see it right here, just north of Lvov. He writes probably the most important work, or the most significant work of Jewish philosophy that comes out of the entire period of Eastern European Haskalah, a work called More Nevuchei Hazman. Now, More Nevuchei Hazman is not a scandalous work. It is a work that does incorporate some modern philosophy into it, but it's a work that ultimately is there to argue for the specialness of Judaism and for its continued relevance in a modern world. Nachman Krachmal becomes a parnas in Zolkiev, which means he has a rather elevated communal position. He was regarded as a staunch a leader in the Jewish community of Zolkiev, and ultimately he will die, not as a very old man, in the town of Tarnopol. Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Chayes is born in Brody. Born in Brody means he speaks German. Okay. He studies under a man by the name of Ephraim Zalman Margulis. Does that name mean anything to anybody? Okay, very good. The Mate Ephraim, Yad Ephraim, multiple well-known and well-regarded commentaries on halacha, Shulchan Aruch. One of the great gedolim of his time, Tzvi Hirsch learns under his tutelage. In 1827, Tzvi Hirsch is appointed the rabbi of Zolkiev, with the support of Nachman Krachma. This is a rabbi, a very well steeped rabbi in Talmud, right, and traditional learning, highly regarded, also making his rounds in these circles of more educated, Westernly educated Jewish intellectuals. He writes a work called Mevo HaTalmud, right, which is almost an early academic work trying to explain how Talmud works, right? What the various different ways in which, right, the Tanaim and Amoraim operate, way in which a sugya progresses. Right? He writes that in the 1830s and 1840s. Tzvi Chayes, of course, it also writes Chidushim and Shas. In fact, go next door, take any Vilna Shas off of the shelf, and in the back of the Vilna Shas, you will find the Chidushim of the Maharat Tzchias, right? That is Tzvi Hirsch Chayes. Tzvi Hirsch Chayes, therefore, is living literally at the epicenter of traditional Jewish world. He's writing Chidushim and Shas. He's writing Shuvos. And he is writing works that are also belong to this academic world. In fact, he will pass an exam to become a official teacher. He will pass an exam that some say is the equivalent of a doctorate of philosophy. And what's fascinating is that Tzvi Hirsch Chayes, the expert on Tzvi Hirsch Chayes in the world, almost somebody who almost followed in the footsteps of Tzvi Hirsch Chayes himself, straddling these two worlds of academics, right, and the epitome of the traditional world, who I believe passed away just this past year. Right? Does that name mean anything to anybody? Huh? Okay, Rebbitzin David, of course. Like everybody knows Rebbitzin David. Yes, right? Rebbitzin David. This is the daughter of. Let's start there. Okay, this is the daughter of Rav Hutner, right? Who writes her PhD for Columbia University in 1971 on Rav Tzvi Hirsch Chayes, which of course means that she could learn, right? Tzvi Hirsch Chayes, right? And then she will go on to become an incredibly well respected, beloved educator, and founds what school? BJJ, right? In Jerusalem. So she writes her, right, dissertation on Tzvi Hirsch Chayes, a traditionalist and a maskil, somebody who seems to straddle both worlds, as she does to some extent herself. Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport, born in Lvov, right here, south of Zolkiev. In 1810, he marries the daughter of Aryeh Leib Heller. Does that name mean anything to anyone? Not the Tosfos Yontif. Yeah, very good. Aryeh Leib Heller is the author of the Ktsos, one of the great works, right? It is technically a commentary on Shulchan Aruch, but it is known much more for its lamdus, considered to be one of the great works of lamdus, still studied in all yeshivas today. He marries his daughter. In 1838, with the help of Yosef Perl, he becomes the rabbi of Tarnopol. I heard somebody say before, yes, he was known by the acronym SHEER, right? He will ultimately, get there in a second, right? Leave, right? Tarnopol for Prague, where he will serve as the Rav of Prague, right, until his death in 1867. He will publish the work of his father-in-law, like the Avnei Miluim. And he will publish his own work, like Erech Milin, which is a dictionary of sorts, an encyclopedia of Shas, which once again will combine the work of your more academic, Western-influenced Jewish intellectuals with the world of Torah, right, and traditionalism in a way, right, that was rather seamless in its time. So, are we confused yet? So often when the story of the Haskalah is told, it's the story of good guys and bad guys, right? And depending on where you're telling the story, that'll determine who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, right? Told in Orthodox circles, so the good guys are the traditionalists, the bad guys are the maskilim, who come in and undermine everything that traditionalism had to stand for. If you're telling the story in academic circles, it usually works in the reverse, right? But either way, there tends to be good guys and bad guys, right, that seem to be at odds with one another. The truth of the matter is that certainly early on in the Eastern European Haskalah, one was rather indistinguishable from the other, right? It was confusing. These were people who walked back and forth into these two, were in and out of these two worlds with great ease. And another one would be Isaac Ber Levinson. Born in Kremenetz, he travels to Brody, to Lvov, and to Zolkiev. He becomes a teacher in Tarnopol. He's friends with Yosef Perl, with Nachman Krachmal, and with Shir. He will write a work called Divrei Tzadikim, which also, like Yosef Perl, is a pretty harsh critique of the world of Hasidus. But the work that he's best known for is this one, to Dabi Yisrael. He writes it in 1828, and he argues that it is time for Jews to take back their right place in the world of culture, in the world of history. Jews, he says, were used to be fully engaged in the society around them. Who do you think he pointed to as the greatest example thereof? Exactly, Rambam. It spoke the language of the country he lived, for sure. Right? Fully engaged in the world around him. Yet educated both in the world of Torah and in the world of science and math of his day. Says Isaac Ber Levinson, it's time for us to go back to that. It's time for us to recapture what we've lost, to study Torah together with Hebrew, to study our native language together with Yiddish, to learn our secular studies together with our Torah studies. This work, much more than anything else that came out of the Galician Haskalah, begins to circulate.
I'm sure he taught them and they honored him. He didn't adapt to their ways and beliefs.
He was not let's try to erase any preconceived notions we have what Haskalah was or was not. Isaac Ber Levinson at this point is not arguing that we give up any of our traditional beliefs. And he is a traditional Jew through and through. In fact, if you open up the original version of Dabi Yisrael, on the first page, you will find a Haskama to this work written by Avram Abel Pasveler, right, the Rav of Vilna at the time. This is a traditional work written by a traditional man. That is not to say some didn't see this as potentially scandalous. There were certainly those who will push back against it, but that is not at all where it is coming from, at least at first, when it's published in 1828. Here is that first version, and you can see what it's coming to teach. Ya'id b'chol ish Yisrael abad nesoret habrit al hechrech limud Torah al seder yashar v'limud lashon hakodesh al pi hadikduk b'asher hu ivri gam lashonot la'aziyot ha'achrechiyot u'bifrat lashon ha'medina b'asher hu medini v'limud chachmot v'hamadaim kasher hu nefesh chaya naskeret ish kefi kocho. It's simply a case for learning alongside one's Judaism, one's Torah, to learn the language of the land, to learn Hebrew with its diktuk, and to learn secular studies. The Galician Haskalah was undoubtedly
influenced by the West. And these are people who are going back and forth to Brody. Brody is a Prussian town. It's what will become Germany, right, later on. These are people who speak German. These are people who are influenced by the high culture of Western European Jews in the first half of the 19th century. Galician Haskalah, though, does not take off in its own space. That is an area that was and will be dominated by the Hasidic world. They do not find an open ear. They do not make much headway at all in the areas of Galicia, southern Poland, and the Ukraine. But particularly a work like Isaac Ber Levinson's Tudabi Israel will find an audience. It's just not in Galicia. I'm going to explain. Tudabi Israel is arguing for education. The Galician Haskalah is also severely critical of Hasidus. Now, there's another group of Jews at the time who is also pretty critical of Hasidus. Where do they live? Lita, Vilna, right? They are very traditional Jews who belong to what we refer to as the rise of the yeshiva movement. These are known as Misnagdim. These are traditional Jews who are fiercely critical of Hasidus. And what do they value over all things? Learning, study. So you have a group of people down here who are advocating, right, a reformed way of study, but something which will appeal to those who are more intellectually inclined, right? It's a conversation that will only have fertile ground amongst those who are already interested in study. And it's tinged with a critique, sometimes rather harsh, of Hasidus, which also is going to find fertile ground in the area of Vilna. Now, another thing, though, is going to happen at the very same time. Remember this guy? Right? Appointed by Tsar Nicholas. What was his big project? What did Nicholas want him to do? Schooling. Right? Schooling for Jews. Coming from a very different place with a very different agenda, Yuvarov, at the very same time, was also looking to change the way in which Jews would be schooled. And yes, he too was looking for a more modern type of approach to their schooling, one that would involve the study of Russian, one that would involve some basic math, right? Some that would involve geography, in addition to their Jewish studies, because he knew that any program that would eliminate Jewish studies completely would never take off in the Pale of Settlement. So you have Jews who were arguing for a change in the way Jews study, and you have the Russian Tsar arguing for a change in the way in which Jews will study. And so now there becomes a synergy between the two. And from there emerges what we know today as the Vilna Haskalah. There will become much more fertile ground for these ideas to take root up in the north, in Vilna and its environs, than there ever will be down in southern Poland or the Ukraine. So let's talk about Yuvarov's initiatives and its impact on our story of Haskalah. So in 1844, a law is passed. Right? Remember, Max Lilienthal had gone on this long trip throughout the Pale of Settlement to try and convince Jews to come on to this project of state-sponsored schools for Jews. In 1844, a law is passed establishing, right, this special schools for the education of Jewish youth. In 1849, the first one is opened. By 1855, there are 71 such schools, along with the rabbinical seminaries in Vilna and Zhytomyr throughout, right, the Pale of Settlement. 71 schools by 1855. Now, what is the impact of these state-run Jewish schools? The truth of the matter is, it's not in its numbers. We estimate about 3,000 students by 1855, so about 50 per school. That's a drop in the bucket when we're talking about this massive and massively growing population of Eastern European Jewry. But its impact was profound nonetheless. Anybody want to take a guess why? What does this do for this early circle of intellectuals who were trying to push this program of educational reform, of acculturation or a higher culture of Jews? What does the advent of these schools do for them?
Support our students.
How does it support it?
The idea of modernizing their studies,
So it does support it in an important way, but not the way you might have thought. Right? The impact of these schools is not so much in the students that they were educating. Right? Its impact was actually in the people it was employing. Because up until this point, if you had these ideas, right, and yet you lived within this fiercely traditional Jewish world, you lived in a shtetl, and yet you had these ideas, you actually had to keep them to yourself for the most part. Right? And if you wanted a job, you had better keep those things to yourself. You can't discuss these things openly because you can't live if you do. Now come along these state-run schools. And you know what I can do? I no longer depend on the Jewish community for my parnasa anymore. Who do I depend on instead? The state. And so now I can live off of that salary and I can begin to write the things I want to write and say the things I want to say. And whether I am accepted in shul or I'm not accepted in shul becomes a little bit less of an issue. And that indeed is what will happen. And of course, there'll be a reaction to every action. Now these ideas that were up until this point being circulated amongst people who grew up very much in the yeshiva world, very much products of the traditional upbringing and traditional education, who now were reading to Rabbi Israel or some of the other works that we're going to mention in just a minute. Now they not only have a place and can live separate or live independent of the Jewish community, but now they're perceived as being in cahoots with the Tsar. And which Tsar? Tsar Nicholas, right? If you remember from our first lecture, right? Tsar Nicholas is the worst of the worst, right? Tsar Nicholas is the one who brings us the Cantonist decrees. He's the one who forces us to the Perl settlement. And he is the one who is trying to stamp out Judaism out of Jews in a way that no Tsar before him or after him really ever will. And yet, so now there is a perception of an alliance between this small group of Jewish intellectuals and the Russian Tsar, and that will not bode well, right, for mutual feelings of positive feelings within the community. So what is it that Vilna Haskalah is looking for? They're calling first and foremost for the creation of a modern European Jewish culture. That's what it's after. Right? Not the undermining of traditional values or traditional theology, not for changes in the way in which we read what the tefillos that we say or how our shuls look. They're looking for the creation of a modern European Jewish culture. So this will be primarily a literary movement focused on novels, poetry, short stories, journals. It will be rooted very much in the Jewish past. They were looking, after all, to create a Jewish culture, but one that was deserving of praise and acceptance in the larger European post-Enlightenment community. So it would be deeply based in Tanakh, in our history, And it would elevate the use of Hebrew into a language that could be and would be respected by the peoples of the world. And yet, they would continue to be and will continue to be critical of the pieces they saw as backward in the lives of traditional Jewish Eastern European life. What do I mean by that? They'll take aim at the superstitiousness, practices that had crept in that they felt weren't actually authentic to Judaism, but had crept in along the way, and again suggested that Jews were uneducated or ignorant. Those they'll take aim at. They will continue to take aim at rituals in the Hasidic world that they deem to be curious or different. They will, though, be equally critical of things that they see in the Misnagdic world, that they see as abuses of the ideals of Talmud Torah. Some examples. You'll note, before I get there, some examples. If I say the word, let's start it this way. In this world of Jewish literature that comes out of the 19th century, out of the Haskalah, there was probably one character type that is more reviled than any other. Anybody know who I'm referring to? It's a Jewish nemesis, or particularly Jewish evil character that we really find in no other culture other than ours. No, not the Luftmensch, the mother-in-law. Now, see, you laugh. You laugh because somehow the word mother-in-law in our culture, it has a certain connotation, which, by the way, it doesn't have in other cultures. And why is that? Well, I can tell you why that is. Is anybody here familiar with the practice of kest? Okay, what is kest? Okay, good. As part of the marriages during this time were arranged. Right, marriages were arranged as part of the marriage arrangement, right, would be something called kest, which would be a period of time in which the young man who is being married, the chassan, would be supported by his in-laws. And the way it worked in Lithuania at the time is that now with the rise of the yeshiva movement and the focus placed on Torah study, whereas kest began as an apprenticeship. Right? It was a time in which you would be supported by your father-in-law, your in-laws, so that you would learn their trade, which is often, by the way, if you go back in genealogy, men often took the last name of their wife's family, right? Because they would apprentice with their father-in-law, right? The father-in-law's last name was often related to their trade or to the town that they were in, and so they would take their father-in-law's last name. Okay, good. But back to our story, with the rise of the yeshiva movement, the focus on Torah study, kest becomes a way of supporting young men so that they can sit and learn and study. The richer your in-laws, the longer your period of kest. Now, we've already seen this with Rav Yisrael Salanter. Remember how old he was when he left home? I think he was 13. Well, no, he was 10 or 11, right? When he left home, he got married once he was in Salon at 13 or 14, right? And many, as we will see, many of the early writers of the Haskalah fit this same mold. They were young, very bright Torah students, right? For whom a marriage is arranged, and so they are sent away from home at the age of 13, 14. And where do they live? With their in-laws. And this young man now is adapting to life away from home, far away from home, with no telephone, no internet, not even a train that will take them back and forth every couple of weeks, adjusting to life away from home, adjusting to life with a wife, and of course, under the scrutiny of their mother-in-law. They not only now have one mother, but they have a second. It's truly a mother because they're a king. And the mother-in-law now also wants to protect their investment. They've paid a lot of money for this arrangement so that this boy will sit and study and learn and become the Talmid Chacham that he has the potential to be. Now imagine yourself as this 14-year-old boy who is now hundreds of miles from home, hasn't seen his parents in months, is trying to adapt to this thing called a wife, who's got this pressure to sit and learn and perform in his studies by his in-laws. And the last thing he wants to do, and the last thing he can do is focus on what he's learning. He's got all this stuff going through his head. It's hard. Hence the mother. They'll take aim at what they see as the technicalities of halacha. So one of the authors we'll meet in just a moment, Yehuda Leib Gordon, will write a famous poem later on called Kotso Shel Hayud. Kotso Shel Hayud, a long, brilliant, but biting poem about a story of a woman who becomes an aguna. Unfortunately, her husband has gone away on business. They don't know what happened to him for years. She's trapped and she can't remarry. By the end of the story, he's been located and they've convinced him to give a get. And he sends this get, which travels months overseas to get to it, to get to her. And the rabbis in the town, finally, the get has arrived. They get together. She comes in. Finally, her escape, right? What she has been wanting for so long is there. They look at it and they notice that the tip of the yud is missing, which invalidates the get. These are the types of things that the writers of the Haskalah will be taking aim at. They will take up the role of women. How so? What is it that they see as the problem with the role of women in Eastern Europe, particularly in Lithuania at the time? Women are doing too much, need to be doing more of what? Waiting for somebody to say that. No, women shouldn't be doing more learning. Women should be at home more. The problem with women, as they saw it in Lita, was that they were out working. They were out working in order to support their husbands. This was the problem. Right? Because the 19th century vision, enlightened vision of a woman was not somebody who was keeping the store, but somebody who was home, right? And somebody who was fulfilling, right, the almost Victorian vision of what a woman should be. All of these belied a deep understanding of traditional Jewish life. These weren't people who had been outside the fold for several generations and are looking back in. These are people who grew up in it, who understood, right, what a get was and what it looked like. These are people who understood what kest was and what it felt like to sit in the base medrash and to try and focus when you're 14 or 15 years old. This is a recent work written on Haskalah that argues that the word we have used to define or to translate Haskalah is actually wrong, at least when it comes to its iteration in Eastern Europe in the second half of the 19th century. She will argue, interesting last name, right? She will argue that indeed Haskalah, at least in this version of it, is not a search for, it doesn't belong lumped in with the word enlightenment. Enlightenment brings forth ideas of empiricism, of the scientific revolution, of rationalism, which can certainly be applied to people like Mendelssohn and those in his circles in the late 18th century. By the time this rises in 19th century Eastern Europe, this is much more romanticism than it is enlightenment. These aren't scientists. These aren't atheists or deists. These are people who are arguing for the recreation of some past. Whether it ever existed or not doesn't really quite matter. But they're looking to take the basic underpinnings of their culture and bring it back to life again. Theirs was a rebellion against the Jewish present in the name of an invented Jewish past that was supposed to transfigure the Jewish future by reclaiming this idyllic past when Hebrew was spoken, biblical times, when we had a culture, right, a Jewish culture that flourished, which has been repressed because we've been oppressed for hundreds of years. Today, they want to take it back, reclaim it, put aside the stuff that has crept into Judaism over the past 100, 200 years, whether it be from the world of Hasidus or the world of the Misnagdim, and get back to some idyllic past that will ultimately change their future. Because with this new Jewish modern culture, you will be more accepted in the world of contemporary European culture. So let's meet a couple of these writers. Mordechai Aaron Ginsburg, born in Salant. He studies under his fathers, and then at the age of 12, right, he is married, right, and goes to live with his in-laws. He will publish works of history, like this one. Gilot, not Gullus, Gilot Haaretz HaChadasha, Al Yidei Christoph Columbus, right? The discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus, making its way into theaters in Eastern Europe in the middle of the 19th century. That was a little late. He's translating works, right, of Western European history into Hebrew, right, so that Jews in Eastern Europe can write it. By the way, this work too has the Haskalah of Rav Avram Abla, right, Paslaver of Vilna. Perhaps most importantly, though, Mordechai Aaron Ginsburg writes this work, Kiryat Sefer. Kvutza mechtevei sochrim u'mechtevei re'im midabrim minyanim shonim sidurim al tarat lashon hakodesh v'toelet yilidei b'nei Yameinu. What is it? Written in 1835? It's a series of letters. They're templates. How to write a letter in Hebrew. Because people didn't write letters in Hebrew anymore. They hadn't for hundreds of years. Right? In fact, in the Middle Ages, people would write letters using Hebrew characters, right, but written in their native tongue. Right? But Hebrew was not used for these purposes, so he writes, right, a template for how to write letters in Hebrew. In 1841, he will co-found the first modern school, right, Jewish school in Vilna. Avram Ber Levinson, born in Vilna. He's married at the age of 13, right, and spends 8 years with his wife's parents, right, in Michalisha. He returns to Vilna to teach Hebrew and Bible and Talmud. He's known as Adam HaKohen, right? Avram Dov Ber Michalishker. He is considered the father of Hebrew poetry. In 1825, the first poem that he writes and publishes is an elegy. It's a to Shaul Katznellenbogen, sat on the Dayan of Vilna, right? A major Talmud Chacham of his time, a work called Evel Kaved. In 1842, he publishes a collection of his work under the name Shirei Sfat Kodesh, and he was then appointed as the director of this rabbinical seminary in Vilna. Again, giving him now a platform, giving him independence from the Jewish community. Avram Mapu, born in Slobodka, right? You may begin to recognize these places. Salant, Slobodka, right? Certainly Vilna. He is the teacher, right? In these small shtetl, in 1853, he writes what is considered to be the first modern Hebrew novel called Ahavat Zion. It is a romance of sorts, not the kind we have today, but a much more civil romance set in the times of Yeshayahu, And he was bringing the biblical world to life. This book was quite popular. It would not be surprising, right? By the 1860s or 1870s, to walk into a yeshiva, if there was something being studied under the Gemara, it was this. Right? So these two forces will unite by the late 1840s into the 1850s to create an opportunity, right, for those who are looking to create this more elevated Jewish culture to find a place, to find a platform to begin to express their work. Things, though, will take a dramatic turn by the end of the reign of Nicholas I. We mentioned in our first lecture that Nicholas will get Russia into this war called the Crimean War, which will prove to be a disaster for the Russians. Remember this? This is Nicholas I's son. Himself saying, we cannot deceive ourselves any longer. We must say that we are both weaker and poorer than the first-class powers, and furthermore, poorer not only in material terms, but mental resources, especially in matters of administration. It was understood that Russia had not kept up with the rest of the world. And therefore, Alexander comes into power, bent on changing that, bent on modernizing the Russian world, bringing them up to power and up to speed with the rest of Western Europe. So he initiates a series of liberal reforms. He reorganizes the judicial system. He abolishes corporal punishment. He ends some privileges of the nobility. He promotes university education. And in 1861, in the most dramatic move, he emancipates the serfs. He takes Russia officially out of the Middle Ages. He will also focus on Jews. He will abolish the special Jewish tax. He will allow graduates of state-run Jewish schools. If you've graduated one of those schools, you can go and settle outside the pale of settlement, which means that Jews will begin educated Jews, more Maskilik Jews, those who are more in line with that type of thinking, will begin to settle in places like Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Odessa. What do you think this feels like if you are part of that circle of Maskilim now as Alexander takes the reins in 1855? Empowered, right? Empowered. This is what you've been arguing for, right? Now is our moment. This is our time, right? Who would have seen this coming? Right? A czar who is now moving us towards the west. We have opportunities that we never would have had before. Yehuda Leib Gordon is growing up in this world. He born only in 1830. Right? By the time Tsar Nicholas, his reign ends and Alexander comes to power, he's in his 20s. He will get a traditional cheder and yeshiva education, and then he will graduate the Vilna Rabbinical Seminary to become a teacher. He will teach in state schools in places like Panovich and Telz and other towns like it. In 1871, he will move to St. Petersburg because he's a graduate of a state-sponsored school. And he will head something called the Society for the Spread of Enlightenment amongst the Jews of Russia. In 1880, he will become an editor of a widely read Maskilik newspaper called Hamelitz. Yehuda Leib Gordon also will begin his career in a very similar place. One of his earliest works, I'll move this, right? This says, what do you think this says? Davidu Michal. Right? On the top it says Ahavat. Ahavat Davidu Michal. It's a work in Hebrew about the love between David and Michal. Right? But Yehuda Leib Gordon is best known for this poem. This poem that he writes, publishes in 1866 in the newspaper HaKarmel. It is a poem called Hakitza Ami. What does Hakitza Ami mean? Wake up! Wake up! Awake, my people, how long will you sleep? The night is past, the sun shines through. Awake, cast your eyes hither and yon. Recognize your time and place. Has the march of time stood still from the day you left from all parts of the globe? Thousands of years have come and gone since your freedom was lost. and you wandered away. Remember, we used to have this freedom. We used to have this high culture, right? Back in the times gone by. Wake up. Many generations have born and died. Oceans and continents have intervened. Remarkable changes have taken place. A different world engulfs us today. It's a different time. Zdar Alexander is here. Nicholas is a part of the path. The Cantonist degrees are a part of the path. We have a moment, right, to become educated, to join the ranks of the European enlightened. Now is your time. Well, the land of Eden, is now open to you. Its sons now call you brothers. How long will you dwell amongst them as a guest? Why do you reject their hand? Why do you continue to live only isolated in your little shtetl, not being educated, when the world is turned upside down and your hands are now outstretched to you? This work is best known for one line. It's a line, though, that I believe is generally speaking, not quite understood or appreciated for what it actually says. The line in this poem, that is often referred to almost as the anthem of the Haskalah, is this one. Be a man in the streets and a Jew at home. A reference to the idea that you can be both, right? You can be a Jew, right? But you can also be fully engaged in the world around you. What's underappreciated, I think, though, is the origin of this phrase. Can you read that? Hayei Adam b'tzeitcha v'Yehudi be'ohalecha. Does anybody know the reference that Yehuda Leib Gordon is making here?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Kosher at home and whatever you want outside.
What's the reference? Ooh, very impressive. Okay. Yes, indeed. Yehuda Leib Gordon knows his Tanakh. This is the reference. L'zvulun amar tzmach, zvulun b'tzeitecha, v'yitzachar b'ohalecha, heyei adam b'tzeitcha, v'yehudi be'ohalecha. He's making a reference to Yisachar and Zvulun. Why is that significant? What do they represent in Jewish tradition?
Business and Torah.
Business and Torah, having them both. That's exactly what he's saying. We can have both. Yisachar and Zvulun, you don't have to choose one or the other. This is the way of the Haskalah. These are people who are deeply, deeply entrenched in the world of Jewish tradition, who are using it to try to create something new. This is perhaps best seen in this work, and I apologize, we're going to go a few minutes over. Is that okay? Yes? Okay. This work comes much later, but it also does a great job of showing the way in which the Haskalah is, on the one hand, deeply critical of traditional life, but on the other hand, there's something that it loves about it. There's a certain beauty that it recognizes is there. And nowhere do you hear that more than in the work of Chaim Nachman Bialik and his poem Hamasmid. Chaim Nachman Bialik was a student in what yeshiva? Yeshiva of Volozhin. I've given you an excerpt here. I'm going to read it for you because can't take my word for it. Sorry, I just want to move this out of the way. Sorry. Okay. To the dark corner. Sorry, we're going to start here. Oya Marava, it may come to pass. Who knows? Who knows? My soul yet may be taken as sacrifice as I have offered it upon the altar of God, and from this corner my glory may arise to fill the word. Hamasmid is about the boy who's sitting in the corner of the base medrash, learning day in and day out. Oy, Tanu Rabban, until 40 years, the great Akiva was an empty vessel, a shepherd, ignorant, and he became through the study of Torah like a banner unto his people, and I made a boy. Oh God, I praise thee. Take me as I ask. Take all thou wilt, my body and its blood, for I am vowed to thee and to thy Torah. For her my lips will move, for her my voice will never fail. For her sake I stand firm, rooted to my place and move not hence. For her my body knows no rest. For her these eyes shall ask in vain for sleep, until the thirst that burns my soul is satisfied. With earliest dawn I will awake, keep vigil through half the night till I have conquered all, till I am master of the sacred lore. And therefore, Amar Rava, once again, the voice takes strength and rings across the air. It seemed to me that there above the ark a subtle light was lit as of a smile, God's smile of tenderness above his child. Or, who can tell, a smile of mockery for those who yet alive have found their graves, delivering up their souls unto the Torah. Which one is it? Is he praising the Masmid, the sentinel who stands strong, unwavering? Is that a smile of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he sees over the ark, or is it a smile of mockery? Right?
But then he described him as he lost everything, the sunlight and the light of life.
Okay. By the time we get into the reign of Tsar Alexander, I noted that one of the most critical changes that will happen is the abolition of serfdom. And so you have a bunch of Russian intellectuals at this point who now believe that it is their job to educate these serfs who now have been freed of their still miserable condition in the socioeconomic structure of Tsarist Russia. Well, at the very same time, you have a bunch of Jewish intellectuals who come to the following conclusion, that if indeed what we are trying to do here is educate our masses about how to elevate themselves, become more cultured, well, we've been doing it kind of the wrong way. You see, because we've been using what language? We've been using Hebrew. Hebrew, the language of our past, the language of the Bible, as a way of elevating Jewish culture. But the problem with writing in Hebrew is that nobody understands it, right? The only people who understand this kind of elevated Hebrew, biblical rabbinic Hebrew, are people who are well versed in the yeshiva for many, many years. Their general Jewish masses, they don't understand what Yehuda Leib Gordon is writing. They don't understand Avram Mapu's Avat Zion. And so if you really want to reach them, you need to start to write in Yiddish. And so Shalom Yaakov Abramovich, who's born also in Lithuania, moves to Ukraine to teach. He marries and then divorces and then remarries in Berdichev. And there in Berdichev, he comes in contact with the true poverty of the Jewish community at this time, as well as the world of Hasidus. In 1864, he will publish 2 Yiddish novella, and this marking a change because he started as a Hebrew essayist and journalist, but realized that his market for Hebrew writing is very, very small. If you really want to reach people, you've got to write in Yiddish. And so in 1864, he begins, right? And then in 1873, he publishes a work called the Kleitch, right? And in 1878, Kitzer Maisus Binyamin Ashlishi, right? The brief travels, right, of the Binyamin III, and for which he becomes known the grandfather of Yiddish literature. Here is the works of the brief travels of Benjamin III. There was a very old legend about the Jews of Glupsk, which relate to their descendants of the Israelites sent in ships by King Solomon to the Hindu port of Ophir, where they traded for gold and other exotic things. For sundry reasons, they remained there and opened shops and counting houses, buying from the local Teutons, as the natives were called, at great discounts and selling them at high profits, so that they prospered for long years. But in the end, the wheel of fortune spun round and our merchants lost all and were forced to wander all. Some perished in the wilderness, others safely crossed the border and set out in ships, ultimately reaching the Levka River, in which in those days debauched into the sea. Up in it they sailed until assaulted by a terrible storm. Waves high as the sky battered the ships and swept their passengers ashore. Here they built a town and called it Glupsk. Our modern historians whose erudition can build monuments from mustard seeds have written volumes about this legend, demonstrating with 1,000 clever arguments, in each case leading to a different conclusion, that it contains a grain of truth. Among the proofs advanced by them, first, are the structure of Glupsk houses, which though oddly built are in an ancient style going back thousands of years to the times when men lived in tents and caves. And yet, while many homunculus resembles a burrow or the yurt of a Mongol, none looks quite like any other. If one leans this way, the next leans that way to spite it. If the first stands broadside to the street, the second stands lengthwise. If this one has steps, this one has a ladder designed for acrobats. If your patchwork roof slants crazily up, mine slopes wildly down. If you don't like it, you don't have to look. This is the work of Mendel and Meicher Svarim. This is a man who is trying to capture the world of the shtetl, the world of Eastern Europe, with, again, this critique and satire, but also a hint of nostalgia and love. Right? There's something there that says there's something special there, but there's something, right? There's something backward, right? What we prize, right, as ancient and wonderful may just be, right, decrepit and outdated. Because of the time, we're going to move on. Following in his footsteps comes the man by the name of Shalom Rabinovitz, born in a small shtetl of Veronikov. He begins writing at age 15 under the pen name of Shalom Aleichem. He takes it upon himself to make Yiddish into an elevated language of literature. And he too is known for this mix of comedy and tragedy, of satire and nostalgia, best known for the series of stories he writes featuring Tevye, the milkman. He will actually spend the later part of his life in the United States, in New York City. So let's go back to the questions we started with. Why the sudden growth in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s? Well, it's a combination of two things. Number one, right, you have the crossing of paths of the ideas of the Galician Haskalah about education and a critique of Hasidus that happen to coincide with the ambitions of the Tsar, who want to also reform Jewish education. And this, in turn, gives the Maskilim a place in which to work and a platform from which to express their ideas. But this alone would not have explained the true explosion, right? If not for the crossing, the Crimean War, the crossing from Nicholas into Alexander, when now the whole Russian world feels different. It feels like a new chapter has opened, new opportunities are there. The Maskilim who have been saying this now for a couple of decades now have an audience who are receptive and open to hearing, well, maybe in fact, right? If we, like Russia itself, liberalize, westernize, in fact, we will be more accepted. Now, why didn't a reform movement emerge in Eastern Europe? I think because, right, so much of what they were trying to do actually involved a deep sense of their Jewish past, a deep sense of connection to their Judaism. They weren't looking to undo or unravel Judaism. Now, it is true that at this very same time, you have a process of urbanization. You have a process of secularization that's happening throughout the world. And yes, by the time you get to this point, many of these authors will have taken their yarmulkes off, right? And they may very well not be observing Shabbos the same way or keeping kosher the same way, but it is not because of any deep-seated theological belief that this is not right, or that the rabbis don't have authority. That never becomes part of the Haskalah. Right? Instead, they're trying to build something. They're trying to revive. They are romantics at heart, trying to revive some ancient Jewish culture in the form of Hebrew letters of today. We're almost there, because something is going to happen which will ultimately impact the future and the long-term legacy of the Haskalah. Beginning in 1863, the Poles are going to rebel again. And Tsar Alexander, who had opened the world of Russia to the west, now begins to become more conservative. There are a bunch of Russian radicals who now believe that he hasn't gone far enough, and they will begin, right, to stir up sentiment against him. They will attempt to assassinate him in 1866, and as we mentioned, again in 79, again in 80, and they will be successful in assassinating him in 1881. The result is that Tsar Alexander III will step in. And he will immediately ascend the throne and return to a hardline autocratic rule. 6 weeks later, a pogrom will break out in Elizavetgrad. The government seems to stand by as Jews are attacked. Over the next 2 years, there will be 169 such pogroms recorded throughout the Russian Empire. Now, the actual number of Jews killed in 169 pogroms, probably less than you would have imagined. And far less, by the way, than what will happen in the Kishinev pogroms and the pogroms that come in the early 20th century. Somewhere between 70 and 80 Jews are killed. Not to say that one Jewish life, right, is not enough, of course. But the number of casualties is not actually the way to measure the impact of 1881, because it's the psychology of 1881 that becomes so devastating for the Jews of Eastern Europe. Why? Immediately following will come the May laws, which will revoke settlement outside of the Pale, restrict access to higher education, drive Jews out of the liquor trade, which was a major source of parnasa for many Jews. They will restrict building houses in rural areas, even within the Pale. So what is the effect of all of this? What is the effect for the Haskalah? The effect is the dream has been crushed. The dream of a modern European Jewish culture has now come to an end. They don't want us. Even with all the advances we've made over the last 30 years, there is no place for us in Europe. And therefore, starting with 1881, will come a massive emigration of Eastern European Jews to the United States. There are actually four major responses that you begin to see in the Jewish community. Number one, the traditionalist community will now say, I told you so. We know it wasn't going to work. Right now we have to be more connected, more focused. This idea of bringing in the West got us nowhere. It got us to pogroms. Of course they won't accept us. We've always said that. We've always said that this is an avnavadot yishkal, right? We live by ourselves, and we have to recommit ourselves to that. There will be those who will join the radical movements in Eastern Europe, socialism, communism, anarchists, who will try to overthrow the establishment of the Tsar, and there will be those who will leave. 2.5 million Jews will leave Eastern Europe for the shores of the United States from 1881 to 1924. So the legacy, the impact of Haskalah is probably best felt or best seen not in Eastern Europe itself, but this process, which was best immortalized in the words of
There are no cats in America. But back home in Mother Russia, our family was traveling through the snow to Minsk. Suddenly, Papa saw those huge paw prints. When I heard him screaming, I fainted dead away, and I woke up an orphan. But there are no cats in America, and the streets are paved with cheese. There are no cats in America,
There are no cats in America, and the streets are paved with cheese. So the truth of the matter is, there were cats in America, and only some of the streets were paved with cheese. But that was the sentiment of Eastern European Jewry at the end of the 19th century, that we'd come to America, and there we would find a home for this culture that we built, and indeed that is what we see. 1900. I'll move this again. The Arbiter Ring, the work otherwise known as the Workman's Circle. Right? People know this. Right? 134 cities, 435 branches, 36,000 members, an organization committed to secular Yiddish culture. This is what the outgrowth of the Russian Haskalah. How about the Yiddish press? Right? The secular Yiddish press
an outgrowth of the Russian Haskalah? How about the Yiddish theater, right? An outgrowth of the Russian Haskalah. How about Hollywood? This was a Jewish company, by the way, before it merged with this one and this one, right? To create what we know as MGM Studios today. An outgrowth of an elevated Jewish culture, right? With a focus on what genre, what type, right, of entertainment. What were Jews best at? What were Shalom Abramovich? Right? What were they? Mendel and Sfarim and Shalom Aleichem. What kind of things were they writing? Comedy. Right? This is the legacy of the Haskalah. Jewish American, secular Jewish American comedians. This is where Haskalah will see its greatest legacy. Here on these shores, with a new Jewish culture that is secular, but yet building on something that it saw in its past. This then is the major response to what happens in 1881. It's mass immigration, but as I mentioned before, there were actually 4 responses. There were those who will turn inwards. There were those who will join the more radical parties. There were those who go to the shores of the United States, and there will be those who head to the land of Israel. First and second Aliyah is based on early Zionism, and that is a story we will tell next time. Thank you.